Every civilization begins by believing it has escaped the weakness of the ones before it. It builds higher walls, stores more food, writes deeper laws, and teaches its children that this time the world will hold. But history is quieter than pride. It shows us that collapse is often not one disaster, but many small losses arriving slowly until a people can no longer repair what they depend on. If we are the seventh civilization, are we looking back at ruins or looking into a mirror? We are the seventh civilization. What wiped out the first six? Before the question can be followed into the deep past, it has to be held carefully. There is no accepted archaeological map that divides human history into exactly 6 civilizations before our own. No serious evidence tells us that 6 complete worlds rose, ruled the earth, and disappeared in a neat sequence. The number works better as a doorway than as a measurement. It invites us to look at the long human story as layers of living arrangements, each one built on older bodies, older landscapes, and older memories. Some layers were small and mobile, some settled beside rivers, some planted fields, some made cities, some wrote laws, counted grain, raised temples, and linked distant shores through trade. Many did not vanish in the way a lamp goes out. They thinned, changed shape, merged with neighbours, or left their people to continue under different names. This distinction matters because the human beginning was not a beginning of monuments. It was a beginning of bodies learning how to stay alive. Long before walls or crowns, our ancestors depended on water, fire, movement, memory, kinship, and attention to animals and seasons. Those first skills did not disappear when later societies became larger. They remained underneath everything, like a quiet floor beneath a house. When a city failed, people still needed the same old things: food, shelter, safety, children, tools, and someone who remembered where the next water might be. So the question is not whether a hidden list of 6 lost civilizations can be named with certainty. A more honest question is what kinds of human worlds have already been broken, buried, absorbed, or forgotten. A village can be lost without every person dying. A kingdom can fall while its farmers continue planting. A writing system can become silent while descendants still carry the bloodlines of those who once used it. Even a great city can become a mound of earth, not because the people were erased from the planet, but because the pattern that held them together no longer worked. This is where the title becomes useful if we treat it with caution. The seventh civilization is not a scientific label. It is a mirror for a modern listener. It asks whether our own world, with its machines, cities, records, and confidence, is less fragile than the worlds before it, or only fragile in a larger and more complicated way. It also asks us to notice the quiet difference between people and the arrangements people build. Human beings are older than states, older than cities, and older than fields. The body that walks through a modern street still carries needs shaped in far earlier landscapes. Because of that, collapse in history is often the failure of an arrangement, not the ending of humanity itself. That colder truth gives the story its quiet, real weight. Archaeology often gives us remains after the living system has stopped speaking. It gives us broken pottery, abandoned rooms, seeds in storage pits, bones, ashes, tools, and marks in the ground. These traces are real, but incomplete. They cannot tell us every fear, every decision, or every quiet compromise made by people who are trying to continue. That limit should make the story calmer, not weaker. It keeps us from turning the past into fantasy. It reminds us that early human life was not a rehearsal for us. It was life itself, lived by people who did not know they were becoming evidence. If there were 6 earlier worlds, they were not necessarily 6 empires. They may be 6 thresholds in the human journey. Movement, settlement, farming, cities, networks, and memory. Each threshold solved one problem and created another. Each carried the human body forward, while asking that body to live under new pressures. Each leaves us with the same slow question. When a way of life can no longer repair itself, what is truly wiped out? Human beings have always tried to place time into shapes the mind can hold. A life is divided into childhood, adulthood, and old age. A family remembers before the move, after the flood, before the illness, after the harvest failed. A people may speak of the time before the city, the time of the kings, the time of strangers, or the time when the old roads were still safe. These divisions are not always exact, but they help memory survive. Without them, the past becomes too wide, too crowded, and too heavy to carry. That is why a phrase like the seventh civilization can feel powerful even when it is not a scientific category. It gives the listener a stairway into a past that has no simple staircase. It suggests that human history may be imagined as layers, not because the layers are perfectly numbered, but because each generation wakes up inside a world partly built by people it cannot name. This need to divide time is very old. Long before writing, people had to remember where animals returned, when certain plants ripened, where water remained in dry months, and which paths were dangerous. Memory was not decoration, it was survival. The earliest human communities did not store history in libraries. They stored it in bodies, gestures, repeated journeys, tools, stories, and the teaching of children. A child did not need to understand an abstract timeline. A child needed to learn where to walk, what to touch, what to avoid, and how to recognize the living signs of a landscape. In that sense, the first human history was not written as dates. It was carried as useful memory. Later, when villages, fields, cities, and states appeared, people still used the same deep habit. They separated the world into before and after, safe and unsafe, remembered and forgotten. The ruins we see now can make the past seem like a series of endings, but for the people living through change, it may have felt more like adjustment, loss, movement, and uncertainty. A river becomes less reliable. A trade route becomes dangerous. A harvest is smaller than expected. A family leaves. A craft is no longer taught as often. A place that once felt central begins to feel difficult to maintain. These changes do not always announce themselves as the fall of a civilization. They may arrive as ordinary trouble, repeated long enough to alter the shape of a world. This is why the question of the first six cannot be answered. As if history were a row of fallen statues, it has to be approached through the ways humans remember, simplify, and sometimes mythologize what came before. The mind prefers a clear story because clear stories are easier to pass on. A great flood, a vanished city, a lost people, a golden age, a sudden disaster. These images travel well. They remain in speech after details fade, but the evidence left in the ground is usually slower and less dramatic. It shows mixed causes, uneven decline, local survival, and changes that happen differently from one valley to the next. Human beings began in small communities where survival depended on attention to particular places. That local attention matters here because collapse is never only an idea. It happens in soil, bone, water, weather, storage, birth, hunger, and migration. When later people looked backward, they often turned these local histories into larger memories. A settlement abandoned after drought might become a story about punishment or fate. A city ruined by many pressures might become a tale of a single invader. A landscape drowned by rising water might remain in memory as a lost world beneath the sea. The stories are meaningful, but they are not always exact maps. They tell us that people noticed loss, even when they could not measure all its causes. They tell us that memory is part of civilization itself. A society is not only buildings and food, it is also the agreement that certain names, places, skills, and duties should be remembered. When that agreement weakens, a world can fade even while bodies remain alive. Names change, languages shift, children learn different songs, old paths grow over, sacred places become ordinary hills. The human line continues, but a pattern of meaning has ended. So the seventh civilization, if we use the phrase carefully, is not a claim that 6 exact worlds disappeared before us. It is a way of asking why humans keep building new forms of life over the remains of older ones. It reminds us that history is not only progress, it is inheritance after forgetting. It is survival after simplification. It is the quiet work of carrying forward what can still be used, while leaving behind what can no longer hold. The careful path now leads to a more useful question. If there are not 6 confirmed civilizations standing in a perfect line before us, then what kinds of human worlds have truly been lost? The answer begins by widening the meaning of a world. A world is not only a palace, a city wall, or a written law. For most of human existence, a world was a landscape known through the body. It was the bend in a river where fish gathered, the ridge where animals crossed, the trees that carried fruit in one season and silence in another, the stones that could be shaped into a blade, the fire that turned night into shelter, and the people who knew how to remember all of it. When such a pattern ended, nothing needed to explode. A coastline could sink beneath rising seas, a valley could dry slowly, a herd could move beyond reach, a group could split, merge, or follow children into another language. The ground might keep only a few tools, a hearth, a burial, or a trace of ash. To later eyes, that can look like disappearance. To the living, it may have been departure, adaptation, or grief without a name that survived. This is the first kind of lost world, the mobile human landscape, where memory moved with people instead of being fixed in stone. It is the deepest layer beneath every later civilization, and it reminds us that the origin of humanity was not a city, but a relationship between bodies and places. Another kind of world was lost when people began to stay longer in one place. Settlement gave human beings new strength. It allowed repeated use of the same water, the same fishing grounds, the same wild grains, the same burial places, and eventually the same fields. But staying also changed the pressure on the body and the land. Waste gathered. Disease had more chances to move from person to person. Food could be stored, but stored food could fail, be stolen, rot, or attract animals. Neighbours became closer, and closeness could mean help, but also tension. A small village could fade not because it was conquered, but because the conditions that made staying possible no longer held. A third lost world appeared with farming. Agriculture did not simply make life better in every way. It made some kinds of life more predictable and other kinds more fragile. A crop ties hope to weather, a field ties labour to soil, a herd ties survival to grass, water and disease. More children can be raised when food production succeeds, but more people also means greater need when food production fails. Here, a world can be wiped out through repeated hunger, exhausted ground, failed rains, or the slow movement of families away from a place that no longer feeds them. The people may continue. The old pattern does not. A fourth kind of world was the early city, where thousands of lives depended on systems no one person could fully hold in memory. Grain had to arrive. Water had to be managed. Work had to be divided. Trust had to be maintained between rulers, workers, farmers, builders, traders, and families. The city gave humanity a new scale, but also a new danger: the failure of coordination. If food stopped arriving, if authority lost belief, if trade weakened, if illness spread, if conflict burned through neighborhoods, the city could become too heavy to maintain. Its stones might remain while its living order drained away. A fifth kind of lost world was the long-distance network. Once communities depended on metals, timber, salt, shells, grain, ships, roads, and knowledge moving from far away, they became part of something wider than their own valley. That wider world could be powerful, but it could also carry weakness across distance. Trouble in one region could become shortage in another. Fear on a road could become silence in a market. The collapse of a network does not always leave one clear ruin. It leaves smaller lives where larger connections once existed. A sixth kind of world was memory made durable through writing, monuments, calendars, and institutions. These things seem strong because they outlive the human voice. Yet they also depend on living readers, living teachers, and living meanings. When those disappear, signs remain, but speech withdraws from them. A tablet can survive after its language becomes silent. A temple can stand after its rituals are no longer practiced. A name can remain while its world has become unreachable. These are not 6 exact civilizations. They are 6 ways human life has been organized, strained, transformed, and partly lost. They bring the title back to Earth. What was wiped out before us was often not humanity, but forms of human dependence. On a shoreline, a village, a crop, a city, a trade web, or a shared memory. And because each form began as an answer to an older human need, each loss still points back to the beginning. a vulnerable body, a group, a place, and the quiet question of how to continue. Before fields, before cities, before any wall could tell one family that it lived inside and another that it lived outside, human life moved with the living world. For a very long time, our ancestors survived by following seasons, watching animals, gathering plants, shaping stone, sharing food, and remembering places with careful attention. This was not a simple or empty life. It required knowledge that could not be written down because writing did not yet exist. It lived in the hands, the eyes, the feet, the stories, and the repeated teaching of children. A person had to know which roots could be eaten, which tracks were fresh, which clouds might mean danger, which sound in the dark belonged to an animal, and which path could lead back to water. In this older human world, civilization was not a city. It was coordination. It was memory held by a group moving through a landscape that changed with heat, cold, rain, hunger, birth, and death. This is why the first lost world in our story cannot be measured by monuments. It was built from relationships between people and places. A river bend, a sheltered cave, a line of trees, a migration route, a patch of stone suitable for tools. These were not background scenery. They were part of the human system of survival. The body itself was shaped for this kind of life, walking, carrying, sensing, resting, waking, and responding to signs that modern life often hides from us. When we ask what earlier worlds were wiped out, we have to remember that the earliest worlds did not need buildings in order to be real. They could vanish when a coastline moved, when a herd changed direction, when a forest withdrew, or when a group carried its knowledge somewhere else. For the people living then, the world was not global. It was reachable. It was known through distance walked, food found, dangers avoided, and relatives remembered. One group might know a valley so closely that every ridge had meaning. Another might follow river systems, not as wanderers without thought, but as people moving through a map held in memory. The beginning of humanity was made from this kind of intelligence. It was practical, patient, and local. It did not produce tall ruins, but it produced survival across immense stretches of time. Later societies often looked more impressive because they left heavier remains. Stone walls survive better than spoken warnings. Pots survive better than songs. Bones survive better than gestures. But the absence of large structures does not mean the absence of complex life. Much of that life was made from materials that decay and from knowledge that needed living people to carry it. A basket disappears. A wooden spear disappears. A teaching voice disappears. A path through grass disappears after enough seasons. What remains may be only stone, charcoal, cut marks on bone, or the faint outline of a hearth. From such small traces, researchers try to understand a world that once contained full human days, waking, walking, waiting, sharing, learning, mourning, and watching children become capable members of the group. This matters for the title because the deepest human world was not wiped out by one enemy. It was gradually covered by later ways of living. Farming did not erase every hunter-gatherer. Cities did not erase every mobile community. But as agriculture expanded in many regions, as land was claimed more tightly, as populations grew, and as states appeared, the older freedom of movement became harder to maintain. A world based on seasonal movement can be damaged when borders harden, when forests are cleared, when rivers are controlled, or when outsiders misunderstand mobile life as emptiness. In that sense, the first civilization before civilization was not destroyed in a single moment. It was narrowed, pushed aside, absorbed, and sometimes remembered only through the traces it left in earth and bone. Its loss is quiet, but it reaches back to the origin of us all. A mobile human world can be broken by forces that do not look like weapons. The land itself can move beyond memory. Ice can retreat, rain can shift. Forest can become grassland, or grassland can become desert. A river that once fed animals and people can change course, leaving old camps beside water that no longer flows. A coastline can slowly drown as seas rise, taking with it the places where families once gathered shellfish, repaired tools, cooked meals, and taught children the names of birds and tides. To us, looking backward from a world of maps and satellites, These changes may sound geological and distant. To the people living through them, they would have been felt as changes in walking, hunger, waiting, and return. A place that had always given food might give less. A path that had always been safe might end at water. A dry season might stretch longer than older people remembered. The human beginning was tied to movement, but movement needs somewhere to go. When the old routes failed, people did not always disappear. More often they adjusted, divided, followed new animals, met other groups, or carried fragments of older knowledge into unfamiliar ground. This is why the word wiped must be used carefully. A landscape can be wiped from human use without its people being wiped from life. A shoreline settlement can vanish beneath the sea while descendants continue inland. A hunting route can become useless while the group that knew it survives elsewhere. A memory can remain for generations after the exact place can no longer be reached. In this older world, loss was often spatial before it was political. There were no kings to overthrow, no palace records to burn, no written archives to close. What could be lost was access. Access to water, to stone, to seasonal plants, to animals, to burial places, to the routes that connected one human group with another. When access changes, the body feels history directly. Feet must travel farther. Children must be carried longer. Food must be shared more carefully. Risk becomes part of ordinary decision. This connects the ancient past to the origin of human beings in a very simple way. Our species did not begin as a creature above nature, watching it from a distance. It began inside shifting environments, trying to read them well enough to live through another season. Climate change at the end of ice ages was not the only force that changed human worlds, but it gives a clear example. As colder periods gave way to warmer ones in many regions, plants and animals shifted their ranges. Some large animals declined or disappeared for reasons that could include climate pressure, human hunting, and complex ecological change. It is rarely honest to reduce such changes to one cause everywhere. The evidence is different from place to place. But for small human communities, the result could still be profound. If a familiar prey animal became scarce, the group had to change. If a useful plant moved higher into hills or farther north, gathering changed. If new wetlands formed where dry ground had been, travel changed. If old coastal plains were flooded, traces of human life could sink beyond ordinary discovery. Much of the earliest human record may now lie under water or under deep layers of sediment, not because it was imaginary, but because the places people liked to live were often near water, and water is one of the great reshapers of history. This matters for the question of vanished worlds. Later ruins stand above ground and ask to be noticed. The oldest losses may be quiet, because the ground that held them is gone, hidden, or transformed. A tool found far from an old shoreline may be only a surviving edge of a much larger pattern. A cave painting may be a rare preserved voice from a world where most expression used wood, skin, fibre, movement, and speech. A fire pit may be the only remaining sign of a night that was once full of people. The deeper we look, the more we have to accept that human history is not only what survived, it is also what had no durable material to protect it. For mobile communities, the end of a world could happen when the map inside the elders no longer matched the land beneath the children's feet. That kind of ending leaves no single date. It leaves replacement, migration, silence, and sometimes continuity under another shape. The people moved, but the old relationship between body, memory, and place did not move unchanged. It was revised by necessity. In that revision, something ancient was saved, and something ancient was lost. What remains from the oldest human worlds is never equal to what once existed. Archaeology is not a complete memory. It is a patient reading of what survived long enough to be found. For the mobile communities of deep time, the surviving record is especially uneven. Stone tools may remain because stone is stubborn. Burned bone may remain because fire changed it. Cave walls may hold marks where shelter protected pigment from weather. Shells may gather in ancient heaps. A burial may survive if soil, water, and chance allowed it. But the greater part of life was made from things that return quickly to the earth. Wood, skin, fibre, leaves, spoken knowledge, soft footprints, gestures, songs, warnings, and the quiet teaching that passed from older hands to younger hands. This means the first human world is not silent because it was simple. It is silent because most of its materials were never meant to last for thousands of years. A person could spend a lifetime knowing how to make a basket, choose a camp, prepare food, recognize danger, or calm a child in the dark, and almost none of that skill would become a clear object in the ground. When we look for the first lost world, we are therefore looking through a very narrow window. We see the durable edges of a much wider human life. A shaped stone can tell us that a hand struck with purpose. Cut marks on bone can show that animals were processed with tools. Charcoal can show the use of fire. Pollen and plant remains can hint at climate and landscape. Ancient DNA, when preserved, can reveal relationships between populations, movements, mixture, and continuity. But every trace has limits. A tool does not tell us the full story of the person who carried it. A hearth does not preserve the voices around it. A skeleton can tell us something about age, health, diet, injury, or ancestry, but it does not give us a complete life. The honesty of the story depends on respecting that boundary. It would be easy to turn small traces into a dramatic legend of a vanished people. It is more truthful, and in some ways more moving, to say that we are seeing fragments of real communities whose worlds were larger than the evidence that remains. Many of the places most important to early humans may be difficult to study today. Coastal plains that once offered food, water, travel routes, and mild climates were often changed by rising seas after the last ice age. River valleys were covered by later flood deposits. Camps made in open air were exposed to wind, rain, animals, erosion, and later human activity. The record that survives may favour caves and stone-rich places, not because humans only lived there, but because such places preserve more. This creates a quiet distortion. The ancient past can appear to us as a world of caves and tools because caves and tools endure. But the origin of human life was not confined to dark shelters. It stretched across open plains, forests, wetlands, coasts, hills, and riverbanks. It moved through places where nothing visible may remain. The body that began this story did not live in an archaeological site. It lived in weather, hunger, warmth, fear, cooperation, and rest. That is why every surviving trace should be treated as a doorway, not a full room. A small flake of stone may open onto a day of work. A footprint may open onto movement across soft ground. A hearth may open onto cold air, shared food, and the protection of flame. These traces matter because they show that the earliest human world was not a blank before civilization. It was a highly adaptive way of living, shaped by attention and passed through generations. The loss of that world was not total, because some mobile and foraging lifeways continued in different places into recent history, and in some regions still persist under pressure. But the ancient scale of that way of life was changed deeply as farming, herding, settlement, states, and later industrial systems spread. Movement became restricted. Land became owned, taxed, fenced, or claimed. Wild abundance was reduced in many places. Knowledge that once belonged to a whole landscape could become difficult to use when access to that landscape was broken. In this sense, the first lost world is not only behind us, it is beneath us. It remains in the human body's need for walking, social trust, shared food, sleep, attention, and contact with living surroundings. It remains in the way children still learn through watching before they learn through explanation. It remains in the way memory attaches itself to places. Yet much of it is also gone beyond recovery. We cannot reconstruct every route, every seasonal camp, every spoken name, every lesson given beside a fire. We can only follow the traces with care. So when we ask what wiped out the first world, the most truthful answer is not a single disaster. It was time, environmental change, later ways of living, and the fragility of memory itself. The people did not simply vanish. The evidence thinned. The landscapes changed. The old patterns were absorbed into new ones. And somewhere in that long transformation, the earliest human world became both our foundation and our first great loss. There came a long and uneven threshold in the human story when some groups began to return to the same places again and again, not only because the season required it, but because those places had become unusually generous. A river mouth, a lake edge, a sheltered valley, a coastline rich with shellfish, a wetland full of birds and plants, or a place where wild grains could be gathered year after year, could make staying more possible than it had been before. This was not the sudden invention of the village. It was a slow change in the balance between movement and return. People still moved. They still hunted, gathered, watched the weather, and followed living signs in the landscape. But in some regions, the distance between departures became shorter, and the pull of certain places became stronger. A camp used for a season might become a camp used for many seasons. A storage pit might make return more valuable. A burial ground might deepen attachment. A reliable stand of edible plants might draw people back until the place itself began to hold memory. In this way, the second kind of human world began to form. A world not fully settled, not yet agricultural in the later sense, but more anchored than the older mobile life. It was a middle ground, and middle grounds are often where history changes most quietly. To understand it, we have to keep the body in mind. Human beings did not become different creatures when they stayed longer beside water or grain. They still carried bodies shaped by walking, watching, lifting, sharing, sleeping, and responding to danger. But staying changed the rhythm around those bodies. A path that once led outward into wide movement might begin to loop back to the same hearths. Children might grow up knowing not only a broad territory, but also a particular clearing, a particular bank, a particular set of stones where food was prepared. Elders could remember earlier seasons in the same place and compare them with the present one. More belongings could be kept because they did not always need to be carried. Heavier tools became useful. Storage became more important. Repairs could be made in the same location. The place began to gather objects, waste, memory, and meaning. This is one of the quiet foundations of later civilization, but it should not be mistaken for an easy step upward. To stay is to gain some things and risk others. A fixed or repeated place can protect memory, but it can also concentrate problems. Food remains can attract animals. Human waste can become dangerous when people return too often to the same ground. Illness has more chances to move when people live closer together for longer periods. Tension can grow when families share valuable places, when stored food must be guarded, or when a group has invested too much labor to leave easily. The same river that feeds a community can flood it. The same lake that draws birds and fish can fail in a dry period. The same patch of plants that invites return can become less generous if too many hands depend on it. This does not mean early settlement was a mistake. It means it was an exchange. Like so many steps in the human journey, the old mobile world carried risks of distance, exposure, and uncertainty. The more settled world carried risks of closeness, dependence, and accumulation. The beginning of humanity was never separate from such trade-offs. Every new way of living answered an older pressure while creating a new one. Archaeology can sometimes show this gradual anchoring through deeper deposits, repeated hearths, post holes, storage features, tools left in place, animal bones, plant remains, and burials that suggest a stronger connection between people and location. Yet even here, the evidence must be treated carefully. A site can look permanent because it was used many times across long periods. Another can look temporary because later traces were destroyed. The ground gives clues, not complete biographies. Still, the pattern is meaningful. Human life was beginning, in certain places, to place more trust in return. That trust changed social life. It made some relationships with land more intense. It made memory less purely mobile and more attached to visible ground. It allowed people to build habits around a place, and those habits could outlive individuals. A child might be born near the same water where a grandparent had prepared food decades earlier. A dead relative might be buried near a camp that people continued to visit. A tool might be left not because it was lost, but because someone expected to come back. These are small signs, but together they point to a new human possibility. The world could become familiar not only through travel, but through dwelling. Yet the question at the center remains. What happens when the place that taught people to return no longer supports return? What happens when the river shifts, the fish decline, the plants fail, the neighbors press closer, or the stored food cannot carry the group through a difficult season? Then the early settled world can fade. Its people may walk away with knowledge in their bodies, but the pattern of life fixed to that place is broken. In that quiet break, another human world becomes visible only after it has already begun to disappear. Staying longer in one place changed the dangers that surrounded human life. In the older mobile world, many risks came from distance, weather, injury, hunger, and the uncertainty of finding food in a changing landscape. In a more settled world, some of those risks softened, but others gathered near the hearth. A place that was used again and again began to collect traces of the people who depended on it. Bones, shells, ash, broken tools, plant waste, spilled food, and human waste all marked the ground. Some of these remains were harmless. Some could attract animals. Some could carry sickness or make water less safe if people lived too close to where refuse gathered. The more often people returned, the more the place itself became part of their health. This was a new kind of dependence. The body that had evolved through long movement was now spending more time in denser contact with other bodies, stored food, animals, insects, and the same patches of earth. This does not mean early settlement immediately produced disaster. It means that a solution to one problem quietly opened the door to another. If people could store food, they could survive difficult days more easily. But stored food also had to be protected from moisture, pests, theft, and spoilage. If a group could remain near a rich lake or river, children and older people might benefit from shorter movements. But staying near water also meant living with floods, mud, biting insects, and the risk that many people would gather around the same resource. If families returned to a place where their dead were buried, memory became deeper and more rooted. But the same rootedness could make leaving harder when the place no longer gave enough. Here we can see a pattern that returns throughout human history. Civilization, even in its earliest form, often begins by reducing one kind of uncertainty and creating another kind of fragility. The first repeated settlements did not yet have the heavy machinery of states, armies, taxes, and written law, but they already carried the small beginnings of coordination. People had to share space. They had to decide where to sleep, where to prepare food, where to place waste, when to move, when to return, and how much of a stored supply could be used. These decisions may have been made through custom, kinship, habit, or quiet negotiation rather than formal authority. We should not imagine too much detail where evidence cannot support it. Still, the practical problem is clear. More fixed life requires more agreement. A mobile group can solve some tensions by separating for a time. A group tied to a rich place cannot always do that without losing access to the very resource that made settlement valuable. Closeness can become comfort, but it can also become pressure. Children hear more voices. Families compare what others have stored. Skilled people may become more important because their work is visible and repeated in the same place. Tools left behind can be reused, but they can also become possessions worth guarding. A successful camp can draw more people, and more people can make the camp less easy to sustain. This connects directly to the long origin of human beings, because our social life began in small groups where cooperation was essential, but where scale was limited by food, trust, mobility, and memory. When settlement increased scale even slightly, the old social instincts had to operate under new conditions. People still needed trust, but they now had more reasons to distrust. They still needed sharing, but stored food made the question of fairness more visible. They still needed leadership in moments of danger, but repeated residence may have made influence more durable. Every later city would face larger versions of these same pressures. Yet in the early settled world, they began close to the ground, around water, food, waste, shelter, and return. Disease is one of the most important examples, but it has to be handled carefully. The great epidemic diseases known from later crowded civilizations depended on population size, animal relationships, and routes of transmission that did not exist everywhere in the same way. We should not project the illnesses of later cities directly onto early villages, but it is widely accepted that denser and more settled living can increase certain health risks. People are closer to each other. Waste is closer to daily life. Stored food changes diet and exposure. Animals, whether hunted, tolerated nearby, or later managed more closely, can bring humans into different contact with parasites and pathogens. The body is not separate from the settlement. It breathes the smoke of the hearth. It drinks the local water, It eats what the place can provide or store. It sleeps near others. It carries infection, strength, hunger, and memory from one season to the next. This is why a more settled world could weaken without any dramatic enemy. A few poor seasons could reduce stored food. A contaminated water source could make children and older people more vulnerable. A flood could destroy shelters and spoil supplies. A dispute could split families who once depended on each other. A place that had promised stability could become a trap if people remained too long after its balance changed. The danger was not only nature outside the group, it was the new relationship between the group and a fixed place. The earliest settled communities were therefore both an achievement and a test. They showed that humans could anchor memory in land more strongly than before. They also showed that anchoring creates weight. To return to the same place is to build a bond with it. To depend on that place is to give it power over the future. If the bond holds, a village can grow from repeated footsteps. If it fails, the people may leave, but the old way of living there is wiped away. A place can be abandoned long before it looks like a ruin. The ending may begin with small changes that leave almost no clear mark. A family spends more time away from the main camp. A storage pit is not repaired. A hearth grows cold for longer seasons. A path becomes faint because fewer feet return to it. A child learns another route. Nothing here has to look like disaster. Yet over time, the promise that once held people to the same ground can weaken until return no longer feels wise. This early settled world was fragile because it rested between two forces: the deep human ability to move and the new desire to remain. People had not forgotten movement. Their bodies still carried the older knowledge of walking, searching, adjusting, and leaving when a place no longer gave enough. In many cases, departure may have been survival, not failure. But when people left, the pattern tied to that place could still end. A river may have shifted. Fish may have become less reliable. Useful plants may have produced less during dry years. Animals may have changed their routes. Wood, stone, or clean water may have become harder to reach. Other groups may have arrived, bringing tension. Any one change could be manageable. Several together, repeated across seasons, could make a once generous place too difficult to hold. This is a quiet meaning of being wiped out in early human history. It is not always the death of a people. Sometimes it is the breaking of a relationship between people and ground. A repeated settlement was more than shelter. It was memory made local. Ashes marked where fires had warmed bodies. Stone flakes marked where tools had been shaped. Bones and shells marked meals. Burials, where they existed, could tie the living to those who came before. The place gathered signs of return, and return gave those signs meaning. But memory needs living people to renew it. If the group stops coming back, plants cover the open space. Wind moves soil across old hearths. Animals disturb the remains. Later people may cross the same area without knowing that it once held a center of life. The world does not announce its disappearance. It becomes ordinary earth again. This connects directly to the beginning of the human story. Our ancestors were not born into permanent towns. They were living bodies shaped by food, weather, kinship, danger, rest, and attention. Staying longer in one place was not a final victory over movement. It was one strategy among others. When it worked, it deepened memory and cooperation. When it failed, movement returned as the older answer. That answer could save the people while leaving the settlement behind. Early settled places could also be weakened by success. A rich lake, riverbank, or valley might attract more families. More people could mean more help, but also more pressure on food, fuel, clean water, and space. Stored food could protect a group, but it could also create worry about fairness. A place that held familiar paths was harder to leave than a temporary camp. We should not claim to know exactly what people felt. The evidence cannot give us their full inner lives, but the structure is clear. The more a place mattered, the harder it became when that place stopped supporting life. So an early settlement could fade without a battlefield, without a burning wall, and without a single final day. It could dissolve through hunger, illness, flood, drought, rivalry, distance, or the slow decision of younger people to build life somewhere else. What remained might be stone, charcoal, or a hollow in the soil. What vanished was the living arrangement, the roots, habits, tasks, and expectations that made the place meaningful. Before great civilizations could fall, these smaller worlds taught humans what it meant to remain, to depend, and when necessary, to leave. Agriculture did not arrive as a single bright invention that suddenly lifted humanity out of hardship. In many places it grew slowly from older habits, gathering useful plants, returning to places where they grew well, clearing small areas, protecting favored species, storing seeds, watching seasons, and learning which animals could be kept near human life. For a long time, farming and foraging could exist beside each other. People might plant, gather, hunt, fish, herd and trade in different mixtures depending on landscape and climate. This matters because the beginning of agriculture was not a clean doorway between ignorance and knowledge. It was a long negotiation between human bodies and the land. The older mobile world had taught people to spread risk by moving through many sources of food. Farming offered another kind of hope. If seed, soil, rain, labor, and timing came together, food could be produced in larger and more predictable amounts. But that hope came with a price. A field asks people to return. A crop asks them to wait. A harvest asks them to trust weather that cannot be commanded. To farm is to place more of the future into one place, one season, and often one narrower group of foods. This allowed more food to be stored in certain conditions. Stored grain could help a community pass through a lean period. Herded animals could provide meat, milk, hides, labor, or movement. Villages could grow because food production made it possible for more children to survive in some regions. More hands could work the land. More people could share tasks. Over time, farming could support people who did not spend every day searching for food. Later civilization would grow from these possibilities. Yet the same possibilities carried new fragility. A larger population needs more food every year. A field that once fed a small group may not feed a larger one forever. Soil can lose fertility if it is used too heavily or managed poorly. Rain can fail. Insects, plant disease, flood, frost, or drought can damage a harvest before it reaches storage. Animals can fall sick. A community that depends strongly on a few crops can suffer deeply when those crops fail. The older human body had been shaped through long periods of varied gathering, hunting, walking, and seasonal movement. Farming asked that body to bend into repeated labor. Clearing, digging, planting, weeding, harvesting, grinding, carrying, tending animals, repairing storage, and defending the result. It could create security, but not without weight. The bargain was not only ecological, it was social. Land became more important because labor had been placed into it. Stored food became more important because survival could depend on it. Boundaries, inheritance, sharing, obligation, and inequality could become more visible when food and land were fixed in place. We should not imagine all early farming societies as the same, and we should not turn every village into a miniature state. The evidence varies from region to region, but the broad direction is clear. Farming made human life more anchored, more productive in some settings, and more exposed to failure in others. It changed the scale of dependence. Instead of following many scattered gifts of the landscape, people increasingly asked selected plants, animals, and fields to carry the future. This is why agriculture belongs directly to the question of vanished worlds. It did not simply replace an old life with a better one. It created a new form of survival that could break in new ways. When the rains came, when grain filled the storage pit, when children ate, the farming world could feel stable. But beneath that stability was dependence on climate, soil, labor, and memory. If any of these failed for long enough, the village did not need to be conquered to weaken. The system that fed it could begin to loosen from below. The change brought by farming was not only outside the body, it also entered the body slowly, through food, work, illness, growth, and the closeness of daily life. Earlier human diets were not the same everywhere, but mobile foraging often drew from many sources across seasons. Plants, animals, fish, nuts, roots, fruits, honey, insects, and whatever a landscape could offer. Farming could narrow that range. In some places, A community came to depend heavily on a small number of crops, such as grain or tubers, supported by animals where herding was possible. This did not make every farming diet poor, and it did not affect every population in the same way. But a narrower food base can leave marks. Bones and teeth from early farming communities sometimes show signs that researchers connect with changes in nutrition, labor, and health. The human body was being asked to live inside a new bargain. More food could be produced, but that food might be less varied. More children could be supported in some environments, but more children also meant more mouths depending on the next harvest. The hand that once gathered many seasonal foods now spent long hours grinding grain, carrying water, digging soil, cutting plants, tending animals, and repeating the same tasks year after year. Farming also changed the relationship between humans and disease. Larger and more settled communities gave some infections more chances to pass from person to person. Waste stayed closer to homes. Water sources could be used more heavily. Stored food could attract rodents and insects. Living near domesticated animals brought new kinds of contact between human bodies and animal bodies. It would be misleading to say that all later diseases began in the same simple way, or that every early farming village was unhealthy. The real picture is uneven. Still, the broad pattern is important. When people live closer together, stay longer in one place, and depend on stored food and managed animals, the biological conditions around them change. The body breathes different air, eats different food, meets different microbes, and carries different burdens. This brings us back to the origin of humanity. Human beings did not begin as creatures of fields and barns. For most of our earlier existence, survival meant moving through diverse environments, reading signs, and adjusting to what could be found. Farming did not erase that older body. It placed that body under new rules. The legs still needed movement, but work became more repetitive. The stomach still needed balance, but diet could become more centered on staple foods. The immune system still met the living world, but now the living world was more crowded around the home. Children grew up surrounded by more people, more waste, more stored food, and often more animals than earlier mobile groups would have experienced in the same way. This new closeness could strengthen community, but it could also make weakness spread. A poor harvest did not affect only one person. It reached infants, mothers, elders, workers, and future births. Hunger could reduce strength. Reduced strength could make labor harder. Harder labor could weaken the next harvest. In that cycle, the farming world shows both its power and its danger. It could hold more people than older lifeways in many landscapes, but it also tied those people to a system that needed constant repair. The body became part of the field's success or failure. Bones could carry signs of strain. Teeth could carry signs of changed food. Graves could show differences in care, status, or hardship, though they must be interpreted cautiously. None of this means farming was a mistake. Without it, later towns, writing, large trade networks, and states would not have appeared in the same way. But agriculture asked humanity to accept a quieter vulnerability. Life became more productive and also more dependent. A village could seem stable because its grain stores were full, yet that stability rested on rain, soil, labor, health, and the fragile bodies of children who would become the next workers and memory keepers. When those bodies weakened across many seasons, the world built around them could weaken too. A farming world can weaken from below before anyone can see a clear ending. The first sign may be a harvest that is smaller than expected, then another. Then, a season when stored food is opened earlier than usual. People may plant again with care, repair tools, clear weeds, watch clouds, and hope that the next year will restore the old balance. Farming teaches patience, but patience can become dangerous when the system itself has changed. Soil may lose strength after too much use. Rain may come at the wrong time, or not enough. Flood water may wash away seed. Drought may leave young plants dry before they root. Insects, plant disease, animal sickness, or cold weather can turn labor into loss. No single event has to destroy a village. Repeated failure can do what one disaster cannot. It can thin the margin between enough and not enough until the future begins to shrink. This is one way a farming world could be wiped out without a war. The people may not vanish, but the pattern that fed them may no longer hold. Families might reduce what they eat. Children might become weaker. Adults might travel farther for food, fuel, or exchange. Some households might leave for another valley, another river, or relatives in a more stable place. Others might remain because the land holds graves, memory, work, and hope. The beginning of humanity had been shaped by movement, but farming made leaving heavier. A mobile group could carry much of its life in memory and tools. A farming village had fields, storage pits, houses, paths, boundaries, and seasons of labour sunk into the ground. To abandon such a place was not only to move the body, it was to leave behind work already given to the earth. That is why agricultural collapse is often slow and painful. It is a struggle between attachment and survival. There is also the quiet danger of scale. When farming succeeds, population can grow. More people mean more hands, more children, more marriages, more memory, and more defense. But more people also mean greater need. A crop failure in a small group may be solved by moving, sharing, or using wild foods nearby. A crop failure in a larger settled community can become harder to absorb. Stored food may not stretch far enough. Nearby wild resources may already be reduced. Neighbours may be facing the same problem. Exchange may help, but only if other places have surplus and the routes remain safe. If several communities depend on similar crops under similar weather, trouble can spread across a whole region. This is how a local weakness becomes a wider human crisis. The field ties many lives to the same rhythm, and when that rhythm breaks, many lives feel the break together. Disease could deepen the damage. Hunger weakens bodies. Weakened bodies are less able to work, resist infection, care for children, and maintain the daily repairs that settled life requires. Animals might die or become too thin to help. Seeds saved for planting might be eaten because hunger is immediate and the future is uncertain. Tools might break and not be replaced. Houses might decay. Ritual places or meeting places might lose people. Slowly, the village becomes less able to reproduce itself, not only biologically, but socially. Skills are still known, but fewer hands can practice them. Fields are still visible, but less labour reaches them. The world continues for a while as a memory of how it used to function. Then one season, or one generation, it is no longer the same world. This does not mean every farming decline ended in death or total disappearance. Many people adapted. Some changed crops. Some mixed farming with herding, fishing, gathering, or trade. Some moved into new communities. Some were absorbed into larger societies. In archaeology, this may appear as abandoned houses, changed pottery, fewer remains, different foods, or shifts in burial patterns. These traces must be read carefully, because an empty village is not proof that everyone died. It may show that people chose another way to live. Still, a real loss occurred. The old dependence on a particular field, a particular rain pattern, a particular harvest calendar, and a particular community rhythm had broken. Agriculture gave humanity the power to feed larger worlds, but it also made those worlds vulnerable to soil, weather, labour, disease, and time. When those supports failed together, the farming world did not need to be struck down from above. It could loosen from the roots. A city begins when human dependence becomes too large to remain invisible. In a small camp, a person may know where food came from, who gathered it, who carried water, who repaired a tool, and who needed help. In an early city, those links stretched beyond the reach of one memory. Grain might come from fields outside the walls. Water might pass through canals, wells, cisterns, or river systems that required care. Craftspeople might spend their days shaping clay, metal, cloth, stone, or wood instead of producing all their own food. Builders, traders, priests, guards, farmers, families, and rulers could become parts of one living arrangement. This was a new scale of human life. It allowed temples, workshops, streets, markets, storage buildings, records, and laws to exist together. But it also created a question that every city has carried since. Can so many people continue to trust a system they cannot fully see? The earliest cities did not rise because human beings stopped needing the old things. They rose because old needs were organized in new ways. The body still needed food, water, sleep, warmth, safety, care, and belonging. Children still had to be fed, illness still had to be endured, the dead still had to be remembered. But now these needs were tied to a wider machine of labour and belief. A person could eat bread made from grain grown by someone far away, stored by officials, moved by workers, measured by systems of value, and protected by authority. That bread was not just food. It was evidence that the city was still functioning. This is why the first cities were both powerful and fragile. They could gather surplus, organize labour, defend space, and create lasting monuments. They could make human life feel more ordered than the scattered uncertainty of earlier worlds. Yet every gain depended on flows that had to continue. Food had to arrive, water had to remain usable, waste had to be managed. Social trust had to be repaired again and again. If farmers lost confidence, if workers were overburdened, if rulers could not maintain order, if trade weakened, if disease spread through crowded neighbourhoods, or if weather damaged the lands that fed the city, the greatness of the city could become weight. A small group might respond to trouble by moving. A city cannot move easily. Its walls, shrines, houses, workshops and graves hold people in place. Its size makes departure difficult. Its success creates attachment. This is one of the deep patterns behind vanished urban worlds. The city is not wiped out only when buildings fall. It is wiped out when the daily coordination that makes those buildings meaningful can no longer be maintained. Archaeology often sees the city after this coordination has weakened or stopped. It may find streets partly filled, houses repaired with poorer materials, storage spaces empty, public buildings abandoned, defensive walls altered, imported goods reduced, or writing used less often. These signs do not always mean a single catastrophe. They may point to a long shrinking of confidence and capacity. A city can remain standing while its role changes. It can become smaller. It can lose its ruling centre. It can be occupied by fewer people. It can be remembered by descendants under another name. The people may continue, but the old urban system has ended. This brings the story back to the origin of human beings. The first human worlds were held together by face-to-face memory and shared movement. The city asked humans to trust strangers, offices, stores, schedules, measures, and symbols. It expanded cooperation beyond the small group. That was its achievement. It was also its risk. When the lines of trust held, a city could look almost permanent. When they broke, the stone remained, but the human world inside the stone began to drain away. When a city meets pressure, it rarely fails from one cause alone. A river changes its behaviour, and the fields outside the city receive too much water or too little. A canal silts up, and the labour needed to clear it is no longer easy to gather. A drought lasts longer than memory expected. A storehouse that once seemed secure begins to empty before the next harvest is ready. Traders arrive less often, or bring fewer goods, or demand more in exchange. A disease moves through crowded homes where people share water, air, animals, waste, and food. A ruler asks for more grain, more labour, more obedience, but gives less protection in return. None of these pressures has to end the city immediately. Each one can be endured for a while. The danger comes when several arrive together, and when the system that once solved problems begins to produce more problems than it can repair. The earliest human groups survived through flexible movement and direct knowledge of place. The city replaced some of that flexibility with coordination. That coordination could be powerful, but it needed trust. Farmers had to believe that sending grain inward would not leave them abandoned. Workers had to believe their labour mattered. Families had to believe the city still offered safety. Priests, scribes, rulers, merchants and guards depended on the willingness of many ordinary people to continue the pattern. When food was plentiful and water reliable, that pattern could appear natural. When stress deepened, the same pattern could feel heavy. A city is not only a cluster of buildings, it is an agreement repeated every day. People agree to stay, to work, to exchange, to obey certain rules, to accept certain measures, and to believe that the centre still holds meaning. If the fields fail, the agreement is strained. If trade weakens, the agreement is strained. If disease takes workers, parents, children, and skilled hands, the agreement is strained. If violence reaches roads or gates, the agreement is strained. If rulers respond badly, trust can break faster than stone. This is why an urban world can be wiped out while many of its people remain alive. They may move to smaller settlements. They may return to farming outside the old centre. They may join another community, accept another authority, speak another language, or keep only fragments of the old city's customs. The place may still stand, but its function has changed. In the archaeological record, such a process can appear as shrinking neighbourhoods, poorer repairs, fewer imported objects, abandoned public buildings, changes in burial practice, broken storage systems, or layers of burning in some areas. A burn layer can suggest violence or accident, but it does not always explain the whole decline. Empty houses may suggest abandonment, but not necessarily death. A reduction in fine goods may point to trade disruption, poverty, or changing taste. The ground gives signs, not simple verdicts. To keep the story honest, the fall of a city should not be reduced to one dramatic sentence unless the evidence truly supports it. Many ancient urban collapses were probably mixed events: environmental stress, political weakness, social tension, economic disruption, conflict, and disease interacting over time. These were not abstract forces. They reached the human body. Less grain meant hunger. Bad water meant sickness. Unsafe roads meant isolation. Fewer skilled workers meant repairs were delayed. Fear could make families leave before collapse became visible from outside. A city that once gathered life inward could begin to release it outward. The origin of humanity reminds us why this matters. Our species began in small social worlds where survival depended on knowing who could be trusted, where food could be found, and when movement was necessary. The city enlarged trust beyond the face and beyond the walking distance of a single group. That was its brilliance. But when the enlarged trust failed, people often returned to older strategies, leaving, simplifying, scattering, and rebuilding life at a smaller scale. The city did not need to be erased from the earth to lose its civilization. It only needed to lose the living flows that made its stones necessary. When an ancient city weakens, the ground may remember it in fragments. A wall is repaired with rougher stones than before. A street that once carried movement begins to fill with dust, pottery, and soil. A public building is entered less often. Houses are divided, reused, abandoned, or rebuilt in simpler ways. Imported goods become rare. Local pottery changes shape. Workshops grow quiet. A storage room that should have held grain is empty, burned, or sealed without renewal. These are not voices, but they are signs of a living system under strain. Archaeology reads such signs slowly, because a city does not always leave one sentence behind. It leaves layers. Some layers show repair, some show fire, some show absence. Some show that people stayed after the old order had changed. This is why the decline of a city must be understood with care. A burned gate may point to conflict, but it does not prove that every person died. Empty houses may suggest departure, but departure can be survival. Fewer luxury goods may mean trade routes weakened, or that the city no longer had the wealth to draw materials inward. A change in burial practice may show new beliefs, new people, poorer conditions, or a transformed community. The evidence is real, but it has to be asked modest questions. The origin of human beings helps us understand this modesty. Before cities, life was held in smaller circles of memory, movement, and direct dependence. A person could see much of the system that kept the group alive. In a city, that system became layered and distant. Food, water, labour, authority, ritual, and trade passed through many hands. When the system weakened, the signs could appear in many places at once, but not always in the same way. One neighbourhood might be abandoned while another continued. A palace might fall while farmers outside the city kept planting. A temple might lose power while families still cooked, buried their dead, and raised children nearby. The collapse of an urban centre is therefore not the same as the disappearance of a population. This distinction protects the story from false drama. Many ancient cities did not end like a door slammed shut. They changed role. A capital could become a village. A sacred centre could become a quarry. A market town could shrink into scattered households. A place once tied to a ruler's name could be forgotten until excavation brought its outline back into view. The human line might continue through descendants who no longer lived in the same way. What had been wiped out was the urban arrangement, the web of obligations, supplies, symbols, and trust that made the city a city. The stones remained because stones are patient. The order inside them was more fragile. Deterioration can also show itself through the loss of maintenance. Cities require constant care. Roofs leak, drains clog, walls crack, canals silt up, wells become unsafe, roads need clearing, storage needs guarding, records need readers and authorities who can enforce them. When power weakens, maintenance becomes harder. When maintenance fails, daily life becomes harder. When daily life becomes harder, more people leave, resist, or simplify their needs. This cycle can make decline look sudden even if it was lived slowly. A layer of abandonment may sit above years of worry. A final fire may hide seasons of hunger, distrust, or failing water. The first human worlds depended on attention to immediate signs, tracks, weather, thirst, fatigue, danger. Cities depended on attention too, but at a larger scale. They required someone to notice fields, canals, stores, roads, workers, and confidence before each weakness became irreversible. When that attention failed, or when the pressures grew too many to repair, the city could lose its living center. These traces do not tell us that humanity ended there. They tell us that one form of human coordination could no longer hold. A city can feel powerful when it feeds itself from nearby fields. But another kind of power appears when many places begin to depend on one another across distance. Rivers carry grain, timber, stone, people, and stories. Seas carry ships, metals, oil, wine, cloth, salt, shells, and news from lands beyond ordinary walking. Roads carry animals, traders, soldiers, messengers, and ideas. A settlement beside a river can become more than a settlement. A harbour can become more than a harbour. A road crossing can become more than a path. These places become knots in a wider human net. This was one of the great changes after the rise of early cities. Civilization no longer lived only inside its own walls. It stretched outward through movement. The strength of such a world was connection. A place without copper might obtain it from far away. A place without fine timber might bring wood through trade. A dry region might depend on grain from a wetter one. A ruler might gain power by controlling a river crossing, a port, a storehouse, or a road. Craftspeople could make objects from materials they had never seen in their natural setting. A bead, a blade, a seal, or a piece of pottery could carry evidence of hands and journeys far beyond the place where it was found. In this way, the human world became larger than the local landscape, but the old human body remained inside it. People still needed food, water, rest, safety, trust, and memory. A ship full of goods did not remove hunger. A trade route did not remove illness. A palace record did not remove the need for rain. The origin of humanity still sat beneath the network like a quiet truth. Every wide system depends on living bodies in particular places. Someone had to cut the wood, load the cargo, row the boat, guide the animal, guard the road, count the grain, mend the rope, and believe the journey was worth making. Networks made civilization stronger by spreading resources, but they also made it more exposed to distant trouble. When a village depends mostly on its own fields, a crisis may be local. When many cities depend on shared routes, one crisis can travel. A shortage of metal in one region can weaken tools and weapons elsewhere. Conflict along a road can reduce trade in places far from the fighting. Storms, piracy, political disorder, disease, or drought can interrupt the flow of goods and information. If one important center fails, the places connected to it may feel the loss. This does not mean every network collapse happens like a row of falling stones. Some connections survive. Others change direction. People find substitutes, reduce their needs, trade with new partners, or return to more local ways of living. But a world built on distance must constantly keep distance working. That is its beauty and its danger. River civilizations show this clearly. A river can feed fields, carry boats, mark seasons, and connect communities. But it can also flood too much, flood too little, shift its channels, silt its canals, or become harder to control when labour and authority weaken. Sea networks show another face of the same truth. The sea can join distant coasts, but only if ships are built, sailors are trained, harbours are safe, and exchange remains trusted. Roads do the same on land. They create reach, but they also need security. The more a society relies on movement, the more it must protect the conditions that allow movement. This is why the fifth world in our story, the world of rivers, seas, and exchange, was not wiped out only when a city burned. It could be weakened when movement itself became uncertain. A warehouse might still stand, but fewer goods arrived. A port might still face the water, but fewer ships came in. A road might still cross the hills, but fewer travellers trusted it. The human net did not need to disappear everywhere at once. It only needed enough broken strands for the old wide world to become smaller. A wide network rarely breaks in one clean line. It frays. A harbour receives fewer ships, and at first people explain it as a bad season. A caravan arrives late, and the delay is treated as trouble on the road. A shipment of metal is smaller than before, and craftspeople stretch what they have. A ruler promises protection but cannot secure every route. Farmers still plant, sailors still mend sails, traders still bargain, and scribes still count what arrives. Yet the pattern has begun to change. The danger of a connected world is that weakness can travel without announcing where it began. A dry period in one region can reduce grain. Less grain can weaken a city that depends on imports. A weakened city can send fewer goods outward. Fewer goods can make another ruler poorer, another workshop quieter, another road less guarded. What appears in one place as shortage appears somewhere else as political unrest, debt, migration, or violence. This is why network collapse is so difficult to explain honestly. It is not one cause moving in a straight line. It is many pressures meeting inside a system that was already dependent on movement. The end of the late Bronze Age in the Eastern Mediterranean is often used as an example, but it has to be handled carefully. Archaeologists and historians point to several possible pressures: climate stress, drought in some regions, conflict, movements of people, internal political weakness, disruption of trade, and the fragility of palace-centered economies. No single explanation has settled every case. Some cities were destroyed, some declined, some regions changed more than others, some communities continued under new conditions. The value of the example is not that it gives a simple answer. Its value is that it shows how a world of linked palaces, ports, scribes, metals, ships, and grain could become vulnerable when too many supports weakened together. This takes us back to the origin of human beings in a quiet way. The earliest human groups depended on direct knowledge of a living landscape. They could see the water, the animals, the plants, the path, and the people beside them. A long-distance network asked humans to depend on places they might never see and people they might never meet. That was an extraordinary expansion of trust. A bronze tool could carry within it mines, furnaces, traders, roads, ships, guards, and agreements across great distance. If any link failed, the final object became harder to make. A palace could command labour, but it could not command rain. A port could welcome ships, but it could not make the sea safe. A road could be marked, but it still needed peace, food, animals, and confidence. When insecurity grows, people begin to shorten their horizon. They keep resources closer. They travel less. They store more carefully. They may trust local ties more than distant authority. This shrinking can be rational. It can save families, but it can also weaken the network further. Less trade means fewer specialized crafts. Fewer crafts mean less wealth. Less wealth means less protection. Less protection makes travel. A world once wide enough to move metal, timber, grain, luxury goods, messages, and styles across seas and roads becomes narrower. Writing may decline in some places because the administrative system that used it no longer functions in the same way. Large buildings may lose their role. Local pottery may replace imported goods. Small settlements may matter more than old capitals. The human body remains, still needing bread, water, sleep, kinship, and safety. But the distance that once connected bodies across regions has been reduced. The net has not vanished from the earth. It has drawn inward, leaving behind scattered evidence of how far it once reached. When a wide network breaks, the silence it leaves is not always empty. People still wake, cook, carry water, repair roofs, raise children, bury the dead, and search for safer ways to live. What changes is the scale of the world around them. A port that once received goods from distant coasts may become mostly local. A palace that once counted grain, labour, metal, animals, and tribute may lose the authority that made counting useful. A road that once carried traders and messengers may still exist, but fewer people trust it. The old connections remain as memories, ruins, habits, and objects, but the movement that gave them meaning has slowed. This is one of the clearest ways a civilization can seem to vanish without its people vanishing. The human world does not end. It contracts. It becomes closer to the ground, closer to immediate survival, and less able to maintain the long distances that once made it appear powerful. Archaeology can show this contraction in quiet ways. Imported pottery becomes rare. Local styles become more common. Fine objects disappear from ordinary homes. Large storage buildings are used differently or left unused. Administrative marks, seals, or written records may decline, where the institutions that required them have weakened. Workshops may produce fewer specialized goods because the materials no longer arrive regularly. Settlements may become smaller, or people may move from exposed centers to more defensible or practical places. A great city can continue as a smaller town. A region can continue farming while losing the larger network that once tied it to ports, palaces, and foreign goods. This distinction matters deeply. A collapsed trade world is not the same as an empty world. It is a world where the radius of dependence has changed. The origin of humanity helps explain why people could survive such narrowing. Long before ships, roads, and written accounts, human beings had lived by local knowledge, flexible movement, and cooperation within smaller groups. When large systems failed, some of those older strategies could become useful again. People could rely more on nearby food, local materials, kinship, direct exchange, or simpler forms of settlement. This was not a return to the deep past in a pure sense. The people carried memories, tools, crops, animals, languages, and social customs shaped by the network that had weakened. But the direction of life changed. Instead of asking distant places to supply what local land could not provide, communities might reduce their needs or reshape them. A metal that once came from far away might be used less. A luxury good might vanish from daily life. A writing system tied to administration might be used less often, while oral memory and local agreements carried more of the social burden. Later generations might inherit stories of a time when ships came more often, when rulers were stronger, when markets were fuller, or when buildings were larger. Over time, those memories could become simplified. The wide world becomes a past age. The narrower world becomes ordinary life. This is how loss can become normal. The child born after a network shrinks does not remember the full reach of the old exchange. The child learns the new routes, the new dangers, the new limits. In this way, the collapse of a network is also a collapse of expectation. What adults once considered necessary may become rare. What grandparents once saw as decline may become the stable world of grandchildren. That does not make the loss imaginary. It means history can change faster than memory can explain, and slower than a single story can capture. What remains after such a break is often mixed. Survival, poverty, adaptation, continuity, silence, and invention. A wide civilization may leave behind ruins of movement, harbour stones, roadbeds, shipwrecks, storage jars, foreign beads, metal fragments, and marks of writing. These are traces of a world that once connected many human bodies across distance. When the network is gone, the traces stay behind like shells after a tide has withdrawn. They tell us that the old system was real. They also remind us that no system is alive unless people can keep using it. The rivers still flow, the sea still moves, the roads still lie across the land, but without trust, safety, labour, and need, the great web loosens. What was wiped out was not humanity. It was the wide arrangement that allowed distant lives to depend on one another. Writing changed the weight of human memory. Before writing, a community remembered through speech, practice, repetition, ritual, movement, and the teaching of the young. Knowledge lived in people, and every generation had to carry it forward with care. Writing did not replace that older memory, but it gave memory a harder surface. A mark pressed into clay, painted on a wall, carved into stone, or written on prepared material could outlast the voice that made it. This was one of the great thresholds in the human story. A name could travel beyond the body. A debt could be recorded. A law could be repeated without depending only on one elder's memory. Grain could be counted. Workers could be listed. Boundaries could be marked. Offerings, taxes, rituals, victories, and royal claims could be fixed in signs. The city and the network now had another tool for holding themselves together. Writing made it possible for authority to reach farther, for storage to be managed more precisely, and for institutions to remember what no single person could hold alone. Yet writing also shows the same old pattern. Every solution creates a new dependence. A written system needs trained readers. It needs people who agree that the signs matter. It needs schools, scribes, rulers, priests, merchants, or officials who continue to use it. A tablet can survive in the ground for thousands of years, but if no living person can read its signs, it becomes an object before it becomes a voice. This is where the seventh civilization question grows quieter and more serious. A world can be wiped out not only when its buildings fall, but when its memory system stops speaking. The origin of humanity reminds us how strange this is. The earliest human communities carried memory in bodies and relationships. A child learned by watching hands, hearing repeated words, following footsteps, and entering the rhythm of the group. Writing moved some of that burden outside the body. It placed memory into marks that could outlive families, rulers, and even languages. But the marks still depended on living culture. Without living teachers, writing becomes a closed door. Without social use, archives become clay, ink, dust, or stone. This does not mean written civilizations are weak. It means they are strong in a particular way, and fragile in a particular way. They can preserve more than speech alone, but they can also leave behind records that later people can misunderstand, overread, or read only in fragments. A king's inscription may tell us what power wanted remembered, not everything ordinary people lived. A tax record may preserve grain and labour, but not the full experience of hunger or relief. A legal text may show rules, but not every compromise made in daily life. Writing gives history a voice, but it is not the whole chorus. It often preserves the concerns of administration, religion, property, power, and exchange more clearly than the inner lives of farmers, children, workers, and the poor. To keep the story honest, writing must be treated as evidence, not as a complete mind. Still, its importance is enormous. Through writing, some ancient names remain when the people who spoke them are gone. Through writing, we can sometimes see drought, debt, trade, war, prayer, fear, calculation, and hope reflected indirectly. Through writing, a civilization tries to resist forgetting, but no script can protect a society from all the pressures beneath it. Soil, water, food, disease, conflict, trust, and time. If the institutions that support writing weaken, the signs may remain while the world that made them becomes unreachable. A civilization with writing may look safer from oblivion, but even written memory can become a ruin. When the last readers of a writing system disappear, the signs do not disappear with them. They may remain on clay, stone, metal, bone, wood, or wall. They may lie under collapsed buildings, survive in dry caves, or stand in open air where later people can see them but not hear them. This is one of the strangest forms of historical silence. A message can survive and still be mute. A name can remain and still be unreachable. A record can outlive the society that produced it, yet lose the chain of teachers, readers, habits, and meanings that once made it alive. This kind of loss is not the same as the fall of a wall. It is the closing of a human agreement. Writing works only when people know what signs mean and why they matter. Without that living knowledge, the mark becomes a shape. The archive becomes a deposit. The monument becomes an object. The world that wrote it has stepped away. This has happened more than once in human history. Some scripts were forgotten for centuries before being understood again. Some remain only partly understood. Some texts can be sounded but not fully interpreted. Others are known only through fragments. The loss is not always total, but it is deep enough to remind us that written memory is not automatic memory. It depends on communities that continue to read, copy, teach, and care. The origin of humanity helps us see the older truth underneath this. Before writing, memory survived because living people repeated it. A child learned a path by walking it. A craft survived because hands were trained. A story survived because voices returned to it. Writing seemed to make memory more durable, and in many ways it did. But it did not remove the need for human continuity. It only changed where part of the memory was stored. If schools fail, if scribes disappear, if a language shifts, if a ruling system collapses, if a religion changes, or if a population moves away, the signs can lose their readers. Later generations may live among inscriptions without knowing what they say. They may reuse carved stones in new buildings, copy shapes without understanding them, or create new meanings around old monuments. The past remains visible, but its own voice is no longer directly available. This is why a written civilization can become mysterious, even when it left many marks behind. The problem is not only survival of material, it is survival of context. A tablet might record grain, labor, or tax, but without knowledge of measures, institutions, places, and social roles, its meaning narrows. A royal inscription might describe victory, but without comparison and evidence, it may tell us more about power than truth. A sacred text might preserve ritual language, but if the ritual community ends, later readers may not know how the words were used. Writing preserves signs better than it preserves worlds. The human world around a text is made of gesture, tone, status, fear, custom, season, and need. Much of that never enters the record. When the readers vanish, even the written part becomes harder to hold. This connects directly to the question of what was wiped out before us. Sometimes what is lost is not a population, a city, or even a language in the simple sense. It is the relationship between signs and life. A script can remain on a monument while the people nearby speak differently. A city name can survive in a record while its streets are gone. A god's name can be carved into stone while the rituals attached to that name are forgotten. Later scholars may recover parts of the system, but recovery is not the same as uninterrupted memory. It is a careful reconstruction from broken bridges. The old writing is no longer a living tool. It has become evidence. That transformation is quiet, but it is profound. It shows that civilization depends not only on creating knowledge, but on renewing the human chain that keeps knowledge usable. When that chain breaks, even durable signs become distant. The first human memories were carried in fragile bodies, yet they were alive as long as people practiced them. Written memories can survive in hard material, yet become lifeless when practice ends. So the fall of a literate world may not look like burning. It may look like a stone still standing, covered with marks that once spoke clearly, while everyone who knew how to listen has gone. The greatest loss in an ancient written world is not always the loss of the words themselves. Sometimes the words remain, but the world around them has vanished. A record may say that grain was delivered, but not the worry of the family who grew it. A law may describe a punishment, but not the argument that led to it. A royal inscription may praise victory, but not the fear of the people who heard soldiers approaching. A prayer may name a god, but not the exact sound of the voice that spoke it in a room filled with smoke, oil, dust, and waiting. This is the loss of context. It is quieter than the fall of a wall, but it reaches deeper. Context is the living fabric that surrounds evidence. It tells us why an object mattered, who used it, what was ordinary, what was sacred, what was feared, and what was taken for granted. Without context, even a surviving text becomes partly distant. It can be translated, studied, compared, and dated, but it cannot fully return the world that made it necessary. This is why honesty matters when speaking about ancient civilizations. We should not place complete thoughts into the minds of people who left only fragments behind. We can describe what evidence suggests. We can say that a canal system needed labor, that a storehouse held grain, that a burial contains certain objects, or that a text records tribute, debt, ritual, or conflict. But we cannot know every private hope, grief, or decision. The origin of humanity reminds us of this limit. Long before writing, most human knowledge lived in practice. A person knew a path by walking it, a plant by handling it, a tool by making it, and a relative by living beside them. Much of that knowledge never became a document. Even after writing appeared, most life still happened outside writing. The body still carried habits that no scribe recorded. Hands still learned tasks by repetition. Children still absorbed rules before they could explain them. Meals were prepared, repairs were made, songs were repeated, and small worries passed through homes without entering an archive. A literate civilization may leave more evidence than an unwritten one, but it does not leave everything. This gives us a more careful answer to the question of what was wiped out. Sometimes, the lost thing is not the people and not even the material remains. It is the web of meaning that connected people to their own world. A temple stone can survive after the ritual is gone. A seal can survive after the office that used it has ended. A measuring system can survive in marks after the market that understood it has changed. A city name can remain while the streets, smells, boundaries, sounds, and duties attached to that name have disappeared. Later generations may inherit the ruins, but not the full grammar of life inside them. They may reuse stones, rename places, misunderstand symbols, or build new stories over old foundations. This is not foolishness. It is what humans do when they live among remains whose original voices have weakened. Memory does not simply preserve. It reshapes, it simplifies. It chooses what can still be useful. In that process, the old world becomes part of the new one, but also loses part of itself. Archaeology tries to slow this loss by reading carefully. The position of a house, the wear on a tool, the diet shown in remains, the trade suggested by materials, the rebuilding of a wall, the silence where records once continued. Each clue helps, but each clue also reminds us that the past was once larger than any evidence. The seventh civilization, if we use that phrase as a mirror, should make us humble before this incompleteness. Our own world produces more records than any earlier society, yet even we know that data is not the same as lived meaning. A future observer might find our buildings, numbers, images, and machines, and still miss the feeling of ordinary life inside them. So when a written civilization falls silent, the deepest disappearance is not only language. It is the loss of a shared human context. The invisible world that once made the visible remains speak. A human world can be erased by forces so slow that the people inside them may first experience them as inconvenience. The first of these forces is environmental change. It does not always arrive as a single dramatic event. It can arrive as shorter rains, longer dry seasons, colder winters, hotter summers, shifting rivers, thinner forests, failing pastures, or coastlines that no longer sit where memory placed them. A community can adjust once, then again, until adjustment becomes the main work of life. The danger is not only that the land changes, the danger is that the old knowledge no longer fits as well as it once did. A place where fish return may become less reliable. A floodplain that once renewed the soil may flood at the wrong time or not enough. A forest that once gave fuel, animals, fruit, and building material may retreat or be cut back too far. The human body feels these changes before history names them. Feet walk farther, hands carry more, stomachs wait longer. Children hear adults speak more often about what used to be normal. This brings the story back to the beginning of human life. Our ancestors survived by reading the environment closely. Their knowledge was powerful because it was matched to particular landscapes. But when landscapes changed faster than knowledge could be renewed, a whole way of living could lose its ground. Environmental change does not have to kill everyone to wipe out a world. It can break the fit between people and place. The second force is resource depletion. Unlike climate or river movement, this can come partly from human success itself. A settlement grows because a place is generous. More families use the same wood, water, grazing land, wild plants, soil, stone, fish, or animals. At first the pressure may be small. Then trees stand farther from the houses. Fields need more effort to give the same food. Herds must be taken farther. Clay, timber, fuel, or clean water becomes harder to obtain. The world is not empty, but it is less forgiving. A society can live for a long time by borrowing from the future without saying so. It cuts more, digs more, plants more, grazes more, builds more, and assumes that repair will follow use. Sometimes repair does follow. Human beings are adaptable, observant, and capable of changing methods. But if use outruns renewal for too long, the foundation narrows. This is not a moral fable where ancient people are simply foolish and modern people are wise. It is a structural problem that appears wherever human need becomes larger than the local system can carry. A village, a city, or a network may all face it in different forms. In a small group, depletion may mean moving elsewhere. In a farming community, it may mean poorer harvests. In a city, it may mean rising costs, weaker supplies, and more dependence on distant sources. In a networked world, it may mean that one exhausted region pushes pressure onto another. These first two ways of being wiped out are quiet because they often look manageable at first. People do not wake one morning and see a civilization gone. They see less water in a channel, fewer trees on a slope, weaker soil in a field, animals farther away, or food that must be stretched. They make decisions that seem reasonable inside the moment. Use the reserve. Cut another stand of wood. Dig another canal. Plant another field. Travel farther. Ask more from workers. Trade for what no longer comes from nearby land. Each decision may help briefly. Together, they can hide the deeper loss. The world that once supported life without constant strain has changed. When environment and resources weaken at the same time, a society can become trapped between memory and reality. It remembers abundance, plans around abundance, and builds institutions that expect abundance, while the land beneath those expectations is becoming less able to answer. What is wiped out then is not only food or material, it is confidence in the old rhythm. Once that rhythm breaks, every later problem becomes harder to repair. The third way a world can be erased is through disease, not always as one great plague that everyone remembers, but as a repeated weakening of bodies across time. Illness becomes more dangerous when people live closer together, when water is used heavily, when waste remains near homes, when animals and humans share more space, and when trade or migration connects distant groups. A small infection in a mobile group may burn out because there are fewer people nearby. In a dense village, town, or city, sickness can find more paths. It moves through breath, touch, food, water, insects, animals, and the ordinary care people give one another. This does not mean every ancient illness can be identified with certainty, and it would be wrong to turn every decline into a hidden epidemic. But disease belongs in the pattern because it reaches the most basic foundation of civilization, the living body. A society can have walls, storage, rituals, roads, and laws, but every one of those depends on bodies strong enough to work, carry, teach, remember, and repair. When illness becomes common, daily life becomes heavier. Fields are planted late. Boats are not repaired. Children lose parents. Elders die with knowledge still inside them. Skilled hands disappear before they can train others. The beginning of humanity was built on interdependence, and disease attacks that interdependence quietly. It does not only remove individuals, it changes the balance between those who need care and those who can provide it. A community may survive the sickness itself, yet lose part of the human chain that made its old way of life possible. The fourth way is conflict, but again it should not be imagined only as armies burning cities. Conflict can be small, local, repeated, and exhausting. It can begin over water, pasture, grain, stored food, trade routes, debts, tribute, borders, leadership, or fear of outsiders. When resources are under pressure, trust becomes harder. When trust weakens, people prepare for danger. Preparing for danger uses labor that might have repaired fields, canals, homes, boats, or roads. A society living under repeated conflict may still function, but it functions with less room for error. More food is stored for defense. More young people are pulled into fighting or guarding. More routes become unsafe. More strangers are treated as threats. This kind of pressure can narrow the human world. Markets shrink. Marriages between groups become harder. Travel becomes riskier. News travels more slowly. Even when no final battle occurs, the old pattern of openness can be wiped away. The connection between disease and conflict is important because they can deepen each other. Hunger weakens bodies, making illness more dangerous. Illness reduces labor, making food harder to produce. Scarcity increases fear, and fear increases conflict. Conflict forces movement, and movement can spread sickness or place people in unfamiliar environments. A village receiving displaced families may show kindness, but it also has to share food, water, shelter, and space. A city under stress may blame outsiders, tighten authority, or demand more from people already tired. These are not dramatic myths. They are human pressures repeated in many forms across history. At the deepest level, they return us to the origin of human survival. A small group depends on cooperation, trust, and the transfer of knowledge between generations. When disease removes caregivers and conflict removes trust, a society loses more than population. It loses continuity. The young may grow up without enough teachers. Crafts may become simpler. Fields may be neglected. Stories may shorten. Laws may be ignored because immediate safety matters more. The world is not erased in a flash. It is thinned through bodies and relationships. People may remain alive, but the older structure of life can no longer reproduce itself with the same strength. That is why disease and conflict can wipe out a civilization without ending a people. They break the bridge between one generation and the next. The fifth way a world can be erased is through the loss of trust in its center. A center may be a ruler, a council, a temple, a palace, a city, a law code, or a shared belief that certain people have the right to organize life for others. When the center works, people may accept demands that are difficult because they believe something is returned. Protection, water management, food storage, justice, ritual order, trade, or a sense that the world still makes sense. But when pressure grows and the center gives less than it takes, belief can thin. Farmers may resent grain demands. Workers may avoid labor duties. Soldiers may follow local leaders instead of distant ones. Families may hide food, leave quietly, or turn towards smaller loyalties. A wall can still stand, while authority inside it weakens. A palace can still rise above a city while fewer people believe it can protect them. This kind of collapse is not only political. It is emotional and practical. Civilization requires people to act as if the shared system is worth maintaining. When enough people stop acting that way, the system begins to lose its daily life. The origin of humanity helps explain why this matters. Human beings first survived in groups small enough for trust to be personal. Later civilizations asked people to trust strangers. Offices, titles, seals, measurements, taxes, laws, and stories about order. That expanded trust made large societies possible. But expanded trust must be renewed. It cannot live only on monuments. If a center fails to repair canals, secure roads, protect harvests, settle disputes, or explain suffering in ways people still accept, loyalty may retreat toward family, village, clan, neighborhood, or local survival. What is wiped out is not necessarily the population, it is the larger agreement that once held many lives in one structure. The sixth way is the loss of the network that supports daily life. A society may believe it is strong because it has many parts: roads, markets, storehouses, ports, workshops, farms, writing, officials, and specialized labor. Yet complexity can become dependence. A potter needs clay and fuel. A metal worker needs ore, charcoal, tools, and exchange. A city needs food from beyond itself. A ruler needs information. A trader needs safe routes. A priest or scribe may depend on institutions that feed and protect them. When these links work, civilization looks stable. When they fail, each part begins to struggle alone. One broken route may be repaired. One failed harvest may be survived. One lost workshop may be replaced. But when many links weaken together, the whole system becomes harder to maintain than to abandon. People simplify because simplification keeps them alive. They use local materials. They reduce travel. They rely on fewer specialists. They leave large buildings unrepaired. They stop supporting institutions that no longer answer immediate needs. This is how a world can be erased without a final day. The system becomes too expensive in labor, trust, food, and attention. It loses the ability to reproduce itself. The younger generation inherits fragments instead of the whole design. They may still live in the same land, speak related languages, grow familiar crops, or remember old names, but the pattern of dependence has changed. A civilization is not only what it builds, it is what it can keep repairing. Environmental change, depletion, disease, conflict, loss of trust, and network failure are not separate doors that open one at a time. They often overlap. Drought can weaken food, hunger can weaken bodies, weak bodies can weaken labor, weak labor can reduce maintenance, poor maintenance can damage trust, lost trust can reduce cooperation, reduced cooperation can break networks. Broken networks can make every local crisis harder. The old human body remains at the center of all of it, needing water, food, sleep, safety, memory, and other people. When those needs can no longer be organized by the existing system, the world does not need to end loudly. It can loosen until another way of life takes its place. The past often reaches us after the people have already left the room. That is one reason we so easily imagine vanished civilizations. Archaeology usually begins with what remains when living activity has stopped. Broken walls, empty houses, buried hearths, abandoned tools, collapsed roofs, graves, ash, bones, and pottery scattered where hands no longer lift it. A place that once contained noise, smells, habits, arguments, cooking, repair, sleep, trade, and children moving through doorways may come to us as stillness. The stillness can mislead the mind. It makes an old settlement look as if life ended in one breath. But what we see in the ground is not the full process. It is often the final visible layer of a much longer change. A wall collapses after years of weaker maintenance. A house is abandoned after seasons of worry. A field is left after harvests have failed too often. A city becomes empty after many decisions that were ordinary at the time. The human world may have been loosening slowly before the evidence became dramatic enough for us to notice. This is why the image of sudden disappearance is so powerful and so dangerous. It gives a clean shape to an unclear history. It turns shrinking, migration, adaptation, and political failure into a single mystery. The origin of humanity helps correct this mistake. For most of our story, people survived by adjusting to change before it became a written event. They moved camp, shifted routes, changed food sources, joined other groups, or returned to older strategies. Much of that adaptive behavior leaves only faint traces. Movement can look like absence. Survival elsewhere can look like disappearance at the abandoned place. When later observers see a silent ruin, they may imagine an ending where the people living through it experienced many smaller choices. A family may have left first, then another. A workshop may have closed, a market may have become irregular, a shrine may have received fewer offerings, officials may have stopped recording, children may have grown up hearing that the old centre was no longer worth the journey. After enough time, the settlement is empty. But emptiness is not the same as instant destruction. The materials that survive also shape the story. Stone, fired clay, bone, metal, and charcoal tend to remain better than wood, cloth, fibre, food, spoken names, gestures, and daily knowledge. Because of this, the past appears harder, colder, and more broken than it once was. We find the durable remains of a soft human world. A burnt layer may draw attention because fire leaves a clear mark. Slow hunger leaves less obvious evidence. A battle may leave weapons and wounds. A decline in trust leaves no single object. A flood deposit may be visible. A generation of young people leaving for better land may be harder to see. The ground preserves events unevenly, and the human mind then builds stories around the most visible clues. This does not mean archaeology is weak. It means it must be careful. A broken city wall may be part of the answer, but not the whole answer. A mass of ash may show destruction, but not explain why the city was vulnerable. An abandoned house may show departure, but not whether the people died, migrated, merged, or rebuilt elsewhere. The phrase vanished civilization often hides several different realities. A state can collapse while villages continue. A capital can be abandoned while its language survives. A ruling family can disappear while the farming population remains. A trade network can fail while local life becomes smaller and more self-contained. A writing system can fall silent while descendants carry traditions in other forms. What looks like disappearance may be a change in scale, name, authority, or visibility. The lesson is not to remove mystery from the past. The lesson is to make the mystery more honest. Ruins are not lies, but they are incomplete. They show where life once gathered, and where that gathering ended in that form. They do not always show where the people went, what they kept, what they forgot, or how slowly the ending was lived. A civilization can look vanished because its stone remains while its human continuities have become harder to trace. Many so-called lost civilizations were never fully lost in the way the phrase suggests. They changed names, mixed with neighbors, moved into new settlements, adopted new languages, or lived under new rulers. The old capital may have fallen silent, but the people who once depended on it did not always disappear. They could become farmers in smaller villages, craftspeople in another town, families within a new kingdom, or ancestors of later communities whose lives no longer carried the same public symbols. This is one of the most important corrections in the story. A civilization can vanish from monuments while continuing in bloodlines, habits, crops, tools, place names, stories, and quiet forms of daily life. The ruins are visible because they stopped being maintained. The continuities are harder to see because they were absorbed into living people. History often remembers the stone center and forgets the moving edge. It remembers the palace, not the household that survived after palace power ended. It remembers the inscription, not the grandmother who kept teaching a food practice under a different political order. The origin of humanity helps us understand this. Long before states and cities, human survival depended on carrying useful knowledge through change. A group that moved did not lose everything. It carried fire-making, food knowledge, social bonds, tools, songs, warnings, and ways of raising children. Later peoples did something similar on a larger and more complicated scale. When an urban or political system collapsed, people did not become blank. They carried what could still be used. A crop variety might continue after the kingdom that taxed it had fallen. A technique for pottery, weaving, irrigation, or metalwork might survive in humbler settings. A religious custom might be reshaped rather than erased. A language might change gradually, leaving traces in later speech. A population might merge with newcomers, creating descendants who are neither a simple continuation nor a total replacement. This is why the phrase "everyone vanished" is often misleading. Sometimes the visible system vanished. Sometimes the ruling class vanished. Sometimes the written record stopped. Sometimes the city was abandoned. But the people may have become less visible to the kind of evidence that survives. They may have left fewer monuments, fewer imported goods, fewer records, and fewer objects that later scholars can easily classify. Their lives became quieter in the ground, not necessarily absent from the world. This distinction also protects us from treating ancient people as symbols instead of human beings. A farmer living after a collapse may not have thought of himself as the last remnant of a civilization. He may have thought about rain, seed, family, debt, hunger, marriage, safety, and the next season. A child born after a capital was abandoned may not have remembered the old order as a personal loss. For that child, the smaller world was simply the world. Continuity often hides inside normal life. It does not always announce itself as inheritance. Archaeology can sometimes trace this through familiar house forms, repeated food remains, similar tools, genetic continuity, ongoing settlement in nearby areas, or shared styles that change slowly rather than vanish at once. But every line of evidence must be read carefully. Similar objects do not always mean the same people. New people can adopt local styles. Old populations can adopt new styles. Genetic survival does not preserve every custom. Cultural survival does not require genetic purity. Real history is mixed, layered, and often untidy. That untidiness is more truthful than the clean image of a people erased. It also makes the central question deeper. What was wiped out before us was often a form of organization, not a human line. A court, a trade system, a writing habit, a city plan, or a shared political identity may end. while ordinary life continues under different shapes. The past is not only a graveyard of vanished peoples, it is also a long passage of transformation, where what survives is sometimes too ordinary to look like survival at all. To speak honestly about lost civilizations, we have to separate several different endings that are often placed under one word. A city can be abandoned, a state can collapse, a dynasty can end, a trade network can shrink, a writing system can fall out of use. A population can move, merge, or decline. These are not the same event, even when they happen near one another. When we say that a civilization vanished, the phrase may hide more than it reveals. It can turn a complex human transformation into a single dramatic disappearance. A capital left empty does not prove that all its people died. A broken palace does not prove that every village around it failed. A silent archive does not prove that memory itself ended. Often, the visible structure disappears first because it was the part most dependent on wealth, labor, authority, and shared belief. Ordinary life may continue in smaller, less visible forms. This distinction matters because the central question is not only what was wiped out, but what kind of thing was wiped out. Was it a people, a government, a city, a language, a religion, a route, or a way of organizing dependence? The answer changes the meaning of the whole story. The origin of humanity reminds us why this caution is necessary. Human beings existed long before states. They learned, moved, adapted, and survived without palaces or archives. Later civilizations built larger structures around those older needs: food, water, safety, belonging, reproduction, memory, and care. When the larger structure fails, those needs do not vanish. People may reorganize around them in ways that leave fewer grand traces. A farming family may remain after a king is forgotten. A local craft may survive after long-distance trade breaks. A sacred practice may change name while keeping older gestures. A people may live on while outsiders later describe their former city as lost. This is why the language of total disappearance should be used only when the evidence truly supports it. In many cases, the safer and more truthful words are transformation, abandonment, decline, migration, absorption, or political collapse. Each word has a different weight. Abandonment tells us that a place was left. It does not tell us whether the people died or moved. Political collapse tells us that authority failed. It does not tell us that every household ceased to function. Cultural change tells us that practices altered. It does not prove that a population was replaced. Population decline suggests fewer people, but still requires evidence and scale. Even destruction, when a site shows burning or violence, does not automatically explain the deeper causes that made destruction possible. A city might burn after years of drought, debt, unrest, weakened defense, or broken trade. The visible fire may be the final mark of a longer weakening. If we ignore this, the past becomes too simple. It becomes a story of sudden doom, when the real lesson may be slower and more useful. Human worlds are maintained by many small continuities. Food must be grown or gathered. Water must be kept usable. Children must be taught. Tools must be repaired. Trust must be renewed. Roots must remain safe. Meanings must be passed on. When enough of these continuities fail, a civilization changes shape. But change of shape is not always extinction. Sometimes it is survival under reduced conditions. Sometimes it is memory carried quietly into another world. So before we ask what wiped out the first six, we must ask what kind of evidence allows such a question. A ruin can show an ending in one place. It cannot by itself show the end of a people. A silence in writing can show the failure of an institution. It cannot by itself show the silence of every voice. The honest story is less dramatic but deeper. Much of the past was not erased in one stroke. It was redistributed, renamed, simplified, forgotten in public, and continued in private. What vanished was often the arrangement that made a world recognizable to itself. So are we truly the seventh civilization? In a strict scientific sense, no. Human history cannot be divided honestly into 6 complete civilizations that vanished before a 7th appeared. The past is too uneven for that. Many societies overlapped. Some rose while others continued elsewhere. Some collapsed politically but survived biologically and culturally. Some never became cities at all, yet carried deep human knowledge for thousands of years. A single number cannot hold that complexity, but as a symbol, the phrase has value. It asks us to imagine ourselves standing on many floors of earlier human experience. Beneath the modern world are mobile foragers, early settlements, farming villages, first cities, long-distance networks, writing systems, empires, kingdoms, ports, roads, and forgotten local worlds. We do not stand after them in a clean line. We stand among their remains, their inventions, their mistakes, and their unfinished lessons. The question is useful only if it makes us more careful, not more certain. To call ourselves the seventh civilization is not to claim a secret calendar of history. It is to admit that our world is another arrangement built by human bodies trying to solve old problems under new conditions. The origin of humanity still matters here. The first people did not need electricity, written law, engines, satellites, or global markets, but they needed water, food, rest, safety, cooperation, memory, and care. We still need the same things. Modern life has changed how those needs are supplied, but not the needs themselves. Water may come through pipes. Food may come through farms, factories, roads, ships, markets, and digital systems. Safety may depend on laws, hospitals, energy grids, public trust, and distant supply chains. Memory may sit in books, servers, images, and records rather than only in elders and spoken teaching. Yet underneath all that scale is the same vulnerable body. A person still weakens without food. A child still needs protection. A community still suffers when trust breaks. A society still depends on people doing ordinary work that may become visible only when it stops. In this way, the modern world is not separate from earlier worlds. It is larger, faster, and more connected, but it is made from the same human material. What makes our civilization feel different is scale. Earlier networks could link rivers, seas, cities, and kingdoms. Our networks link continents in moments. Earlier cities depended on grain, water, labor, and belief. Our cities depend on energy, transport, finance, communications, medicine, sanitation, law, and constant coordination across enormous distances. Earlier writing preserved memory on clay, stone, paper, or carved surfaces. Our memory is multiplied through digital storage, but digital memory also depends on electricity, devices, institutions, formats, maintenance, and people who know how to use them. The modern world can look more permanent because it is so powerful. But power can hide dependence. A city lit at night seems far from the dark camps of early humanity, yet its lights depend on systems that must be repaired, fueled, governed, and trusted. A supermarket seems far from gathering wild plants, yet it is also a meeting point of soil, rain, labor, transport, storage, money, and order. A hospital seems far from the fragile body of prehistory, yet it exists because fragile bodies still need care. So the answer must remain careful. We are not the seventh civilization in a literal count. We are one more human world built over many previous human worlds. What should concern us is not whether the number is exact, but whether we understand the pattern. Every earlier arrangement solved something real. Every arrangement also created new forms of dependence. Our own world is no exception. A modern civilization can feel separate from all earlier worlds because its surface is so different. It is made of electricity, engines, hospitals, satellites, glass towers, data centers, airports, container ships, laboratories, and devices that place distant voices in the hand. No earlier society had this scale of energy or speed. A message that once needed a runner, a horse, a ship, or a road can now cross oceans almost instantly. Food can move from one continent to another. Materials can be mined in one place, processed in another, assembled somewhere else, and used by people who never see the chain behind the object. This gives the modern world an extraordinary reach. It also makes its dependence harder to see. Earlier cities depended on fields, rivers, labor, storage, and trust. And free? The modern world depends on all of these, and also on fuel, electricity, machines, global finance, shipping routes, digital systems, legal agreements, trained specialists, and a shared belief that the network will still work tomorrow. Scale has changed, but the basic pattern has not. A civilization is still a way of organizing human need. It must still bring water to bodies, food to mouths, care to the sick, shelter to families, meaning to communities, and memory to the next generation. The origin of humanity remains under the pavement. The first human groups survived through attention to the local world, where water gathered, where animals moved, where danger appeared, where help could be found. Modern people often do not need to know those things directly, because systems know them for us. Maps guide us. Pipes carry water. Markets gather food. Schools and records carry memory. Medicine watches the body with instruments. But this does not remove dependence. It relocates dependence into structures too large for any one person to fully understand. That is both the power and the weakness of our time. When the system works, life feels ordinary. When one link fails, the hidden chain becomes visible. A storm can stop transport. A shortage can raise prices far away from its source. A disease can move along the same routes that carry trade and travel. A failure in digital infrastructure can disturb banks, hospitals, communication, and daily work. A loss of trust can spread through institutions faster than any ancient rumor moved along a road. None of this means modern civilization is about to collapse. That would be a false and careless conclusion. It means only that our strength is also a form of exposure. The same network that protects us by sharing resources also connects our risks. Earlier civilizations knew versions of this truth in smaller form. A port depended on ships. A palace depended on grain. A farming village depended on rain. A writing system depended on readers. Our world depends on many more things at once. Its complexity gives it many ways to solve problems, but also many points that require care. Energy must keep flowing. Food systems must remain resilient. Public trust must be maintained. Knowledge must be taught, not only stored. Institutions must be repaired before people stop believing in them. The body still needs sleep, clean water, nutrition, safety, and human connection. No technology has cancelled those needs. If anything, technology has made the distance between need and supply longer. The glass of water may come from a system of reservoirs, treatment plants, pipes, workers, laws, energy, and monitoring. The bread may come from soil, seed, weather, fuel, transport, markets, and labor. The quiet room where someone listens at night depends on a civilization that has already done thousands of tasks unseen. This is the mirror held by earlier worlds. They were not foolish because they were fragile. They were human because they were dependent. We are not beyond that condition. We have only made dependence wider, faster, and more difficult to notice when everything is calm. The modern world often teaches us to imagine civilization as something above the body. We see towers, machines, screens, roads, hospitals, laws, and networks, and it becomes easy to forget the older creature living inside all of it. But no civilization, however advanced, can rise higher than the needs of the bodies that build it. The same human being who can send a signal across the planet still needs clean water. The same mind that can store knowledge in vast machines still needs sleep, attention, memory, and trust. The same society that can move food across oceans still depends on soil, rain, labor, transport, and the health of people who keep those systems working. This is the quiet link between us and the first human worlds. The surface has changed beyond recognition, but the foundation has not. Our ancestors lived close to the sources of survival. They knew water by walking to it. They knew food by gathering, hunting, planting, or tending it. They knew danger through the body before it became a report or a number. Modern life places distance between the body and those sources. Water appears from a tap. Food appears in a store. Warmth comes through wires, fuel, and machines. Safety is held by institutions. Memory is stored in devices. This distance is not false. It is one of civilization's achievements. It allows millions of people to live in ways no small ancient group could have imagined. But distance can also make dependence invisible. When the hidden systems work, we experience comfort. When they fail, the older truth returns quickly. The body becomes the measure again. Hunger is not digital. Thirst is not symbolic. Fear is not solved by a monument. Loneliness is not erased by a network. The biological human being remains the ground on which every historical structure stands. This is why earlier collapses still matter. They are not warnings from people unlike us. They are records of arrangements that became unable to meet human needs under changing conditions. A farming village weakened when fields, bodies, and seasons no longer held together. A city weakened when food, water, labour, and trust stopped flowing in the right proportions. A network weakened when distance became too expensive or unsafe to maintain. A writing system fell silent when the chain of readers broke. In every case, the failure moved through ordinary human requirements before it became an archaeological pattern. The same is true for us, though at a larger scale. Our civilization depends on specialists most of us will never meet, places most of us will never visit, and systems most of us cannot fully explain. That is not a reason for panic. It is a reason for humility. The human body places limits on every dream of permanence. It asks to be fed, rested, protected, taught, healed, and held within some form of community. A civilization that forgets this may become brilliant on the surface and brittle underneath. A civilization that remembers it may become more careful with the unglamorous work that keeps life possible. Clean water, stable food, public trust, patient teaching, repair, care for the vulnerable, and honest memory. To say that we may be a seventh civilization is not to place ourselves at the end of a secret sequence. It is to notice that we, too, are a layer. We are not outside history, looking down on earlier people from safety. We are inside the same long experiment, human bodies trying to build a world that can last longer than fear, hunger, and forgetting. History does not say that every society is doomed. That would be too simple and too careless. What history shows, more quietly, is that no human arrangement is free from limits. A camp, a village, a farm, a city, an empire, a trade network, and a modern global system all depend on conditions that must continue to be renewed. Water must remain usable, food must keep arriving, trust must be repaired, knowledge must pass from one generation to the next, tools must be maintained, institutions must still answer real human needs. When these things are cared for, a society can appear strong for a long time. When they are neglected, strength can become a memory before collapse becomes visible. The lesson is not fear, it is attention. Earlier worlds did not fall because ancient people were foolish in some simple way. They lived with the knowledge, tools, climates, beliefs, and pressures available to them. Like us, they solved problems by creating systems. Like us, they sometimes created new dependencies while solving old dangers. A mobile group reduced the risk of staying too long in one place, but depended on access to wide landscapes. A farming village produced food more reliably in good seasons, but depended more deeply on rain, soil, labour, and storage. A city organized many lives, but depended on coordination and trust. A network connected distant regions, but became vulnerable to disruptions far away. A written society preserved memory, but depended on living readers and institutions. Each answer carried a hidden question inside it. The origin of humanity remains the simplest reminder of this. Before any great structure existed, the human body needed water, food, shelter, rest, safety, care, and companionship. Civilization did not replace those needs, it organized them. It made some needs easier to meet and others harder to notice. A person in a modern room may be far from fields, rivers, forests, and workshops, yet still depends on them through long chains of labour and trust. The body does not know whether bread came from a local field or a global market. It only knows nourishment or hunger. It does not know whether safety came from a small kin group or a complex legal system. It only knows whether fear can settle. This is why the study of collapse can be useful without becoming dark. It teaches that the ordinary foundations of life deserve respect. Clean water is not ordinary because it is simple. Food is not ordinary because it appears every day. Trust is not ordinary because people speak calmly. Knowledge is not ordinary because it can be stored. Each one is the result of continued care. Earlier worlds become most valuable to us when they make us less arrogant and more awake to the quiet labor that keeps a society alive. Their ruins are not only warnings, they are records of human effort. They show people trying to hold weather, hunger, memory, power, and hope inside forms that could be passed on. Sometimes those forms endured, sometimes they changed, sometimes they failed, but the people inside them were not merely characters in a story of doom. They were human beings living inside unfinished conditions, as we are. If there is an educational message in this long path, it may be this: survival is not the same as domination. A society lasts not because it defeats every limit, but because it learns to live with limits honestly. It notices strain before strain becomes rupture. It protects memory before memory becomes decoration. It values repair before repair becomes impossible. It remembers that the future is carried not only by rulers, machines, or monuments, but by ordinary people who keep water flowing, food growing, children learning, elders remembered, and trust alive. The past does not give us a perfect formula. It gives us something gentler and harder, a reason to pay attention. To understand collapse without fear is to look at civilization as maintenance, not as glory. Monuments are easier to remember than repairs. Kings, wars, inventions, and ruins attract the eye, while the quieter work of keeping life possible often disappears into the background. Yet every human world has depended on that background. Someone cleared a channel after silt gathered. Someone saved seed. Someone taught a child how to grind grain, shape clay, read signs, count goods, mend cloth, guide an animal, or remember a boundary. Someone carried water, watched the sick, shared food, repaired a roof, guarded a path, listened to a dispute, or repeated a story so that it would not die with one generation. These acts rarely become the main image of civilization, but without them, the larger structure cannot stand. This is where the past becomes useful for the listener today. It does not need to frighten us with visions of sudden endings. It can teach a calmer respect for the fragile things that make ordinary life possible. The origin of humanity was not built on domination over the earth. It was built on attention within the earth. Early human beings survived because they noticed patterns, shared memory, cared for one another enough to keep a group alive, and adapted when conditions changed. Later civilizations made that attention larger and more complex, but they never escaped its need. A farmer watching clouds, a sailor reading wind, a scribe preserving records, a healer recognizing weakness, and a parent teaching a child all belong to the same long human effort, to carry life forward through uncertainty. When we study vanished or transformed worlds, we are not only asking why they failed, we are also asking what they managed to hold together for a time. That question makes history more honest. A society that collapses was not meaningless before it ended. A city that was abandoned was not a mistake while people lived, worked, loved, feared, and hoped inside it. A writing system that later fell silent still once helped people organize memory. A trade route that later broke still once connected distant hands. A farming village that faded still once fed children and held the dead in familiar ground. The value of these worlds is not erased by their limits. Their limits make them human. This is why the lesson should not be pride, and it should not be despair. Pride says we are different enough to be safe. Despair says nothing can be protected. History suggests something quieter between the two. It suggests that what lasts is what is cared for repeatedly. Soil lasts when it is not exhausted beyond renewal. Water remains life-giving when it is protected. Knowledge survives when it is taught, not merely stored. Trust survives when it is practiced, not merely demanded. Communities survive when people can still see one another as necessary. These are simple ideas, but they are not small. They reach back to the first human groups and forward into every modern city. They remind us that civilization is not only the peak of human achievement, it is also the daily responsibility of protecting the conditions that allow achievement to matter. If the phrase seventh civilization has any value, it is not that it gives us a secret place in a numbered line. It asks us to inherit the past with humility. We are made from survivors, migrants, farmers, builders, readers, repairers, and forgotten people whose names did not last. Their worlds did not always survive in the forms they knew, but parts of them move forward into us. To listen to that long passage is to feel less alone in time. It is to understand that the future is not guarded by certainty, but by care. If the earlier worlds are not completely gone, then the past is closer than it first appears. It is not only under deserts, beneath seas, inside mounds, or behind museum glass. It is also inside ordinary human life. The need to gather around warmth, to share food, to teach children, to remember danger, to trust a group, to mourn the dead, and to make meaning from uncertainty, did not vanish when cities rose. It did not vanish when writing appeared. It did not vanish when machines began to carry voices across distance. These are old human tasks, wearing new clothing. The first people who watched the weather, followed animals, protected fire, and learned the habits of a place were not outside our story. They are part of the foundation on which every later world was built. The farmer saving seed, the builder repairing a wall, the sailor trusting a route, the scribe preserving a record, and the modern worker maintaining a system all belong to one long chain of dependence and care. When a civilization changes or falls, that chain does not always break completely. Sometimes it bends, sometimes it becomes hidden, sometimes it passes through people whose names are never written down. This is why the question of the seventh civilization should not end with fear. It should end with recognition. We live inside a world of great power, but also inside a human body shaped by older limits. We depend on water that must stay clean, food that must be grown and moved, knowledge that must be taught, trust that must be renewed, and memory that must remain honest enough to guide us. The ruins of earlier worlds are not only reminders of failure, they are reminders that human beings repeatedly found ways to continue, even when the form of life around them could not remain the same. A city may fall, and still a family carries a seed. A script may fall silent, and still a story changes shape in another language. A trade network may contract, and still local hands learn to make do. A shoreline may vanish, and still descendants walk somewhere else with fragments of older memory. The loss is real. The continuity is real too. Holding both truths together is more useful than choosing only one. If we see only collapse, the past becomes a warning without tenderness. If we see only survival, the past becomes comfort without honesty. The deeper lesson lies between them. Every world is temporary in form, but not everything inside it is lost. Some things move forward quietly. Habits, crops, tools, genes, languages, fears, hopes, and ways of caring for one another. Our own world will also leave a mixture behind. It may leave records, ruins, machines, changed landscapes, and traces that future people may struggle to understand. But perhaps the more important question is not what will remain as objects, it is what will remain as wisdom. Will future people inherit only the evidence of our speed, our hunger, and our confidence, or will they also inherit signs that we learn to protect the conditions of life? The long human story began with vulnerable bodies under open sky, trying to continue through uncertainty, learning that no shelter, tool, custom, or memory mattered unless it helped life pass safely into another morning. After all the fields, cities, networks, scripts, and machines, the same quiet task remains. We are still learning how to live inside limits without forgetting wonder, how to build without pretending permanence, and how to remember without turning memory into myth. If the worlds before us are not entirely dead, but folded into the way we stand, speak, eat, fear, hope, and sleep, then what part of our own world will become a warning, and what part will become a gift?